who I am. And how does my story and Calvin's and Nelia's story connect so profoundly? I was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1967, and my parents were a part of the movement in Chicago. My father marched at Turnaround Tuesday with Dr. King and Selma. My parents protested the war in Vietnam, supported Cesar Chavez, organized against the Daley administration. My mother and I, as a baby, were just blocks from the beatings in the park in Chicago. In '68, my church that I was baptized in, the Church of the Three Crosses, where I'll be celebrating Chicago Pride Sunday 1 week from today, and marching with the More Light Presbyterians in the Chicago Pride Parade. My church was a sanctuary for the hippies and the clergy who were in solidarity with the protesters. The ministers of my church took the cross out of their sanctuary, a large wooden cross made of railroad ties that was in kind of an heirloom that came into that church from its predecessor congregation. They marched that cross into the park, into the melee between the protesters and the police, and they tried to be a witness for peace between, hoping that the cross of Christ could mediate between the protesters and the police against the Vietnam War. And it couldn't. The ministers were forced to flee the park, and they lost the cross in the melee. And so committed to their witness of Jesus as the reconciler and as the peacemaker that they were willing to lose the symbol for the sake of what that symbol means. And I knew, I don't know why, but there was a protest in California around the time of my birth called the Death of the Hippie protest. Che Guevara died on the day that I was born, and my birth date, October 9, I share with John Lennon, Sean Lennon, and Gandhi. I kind of knew I was set up for this work, and it started for me at a very young age. So here are our founders and my mentors and friends during their days in Cookeville, and they were bohemians. And I showed this show in Cookeville, and somebody, I said, are you sure that they were hippies and not hipsters? And I had to say, the hipster thing came later, but obviously, as you can tell from the picture, they were ahead of their time. And somebody saw this picture on my Facebook and asked me who the woman with me was in the picture. I think it's just the look and the black glasses, I guess, something like that. But I'll tell you that the music of the early 70s, and so as I was, my first coming of age as a toddler, I was listening incessantly to 3 albums on my parents' I had some Beatles and some Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul and Mary and Joan Baez in there as well, but I really attached myself as a young child to Hair, Jesus Christ Superstar, and Godspell. And so my parents took me to the play Godspell in the theater, and the music begins with John the Baptist and the song Prepare Ye the Way. And so I bracket this talk, and when I arranged it with Phil to put communion right after my talk without anything else, it's because this talk is bracketed by the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. So here we are in a theater in Cleveland, Ohio. It's the off-Broadway musical by a Jewish 20-something named Stephen Schwartz. And as we sat in the audience that night, awaiting the opening of the play, there's that moment when John the Baptist comes out, and they have, he's playing some kind of an instrument, and the opening refrain of Prepare Ye the Way of the Lord begins. And as people were sitting quiet, respectfully as you are now, in that theater, this young boy burst out, "That song is on our record!" And the entire place broke up in laughter. And for years, my father Ken would tell that story, and that is really when my preaching career as a toddler. This is a young Calvin coming to Cookeville with his banjo on his knee in '64. And Dave McIntyre, one of his his comrades in the Wesley Foundation said, who had come from Indiana to Cookeville, that he thought Calvin was kind of a hick. He thought he was a country boy, but Calvin was really coming. He, yes, was influenced by the Grand Ole Opry and country music and all the greats of Nashville, but the real influence on Calvin is Pete Seeger. The real influence is, as you said, the Weavers, and also Peter, Paul, and Mary, of course, and the way the folk music was already playing in to the revolution that was taking place in our country through the 1960s. And Calvin, at his Methodist church in Nashville, had a Sunday school teacher who taught him about integration, and integration was just happening. Tennessee Tech had its first African-American students the same year that Calvin and Nelia came there, but they witnessed him as a high school student in all of the nation. The 60s kind of got kicked off in Nashville, Tennessee with the sit-in movement at the lunch counters, led by the people like Reverend James Lawson, esteemed alum of my institution, Vanderbilt Divinity School. And so Calvin shows up in Cookeville with his banjo, and he was ready for something to happen, but he wasn't sure what. Both Calvin and Nelia started out in other degree areas. Calvin was an engineer, Nelia was I think in business, and they both ended up as history majors at Tennessee Tech. But one thing that Calvin did is he got involved in the Wesley Foundation, and the Wesley Foundations in the 60s were attached to a group called the Methodist Student Movement. And as I've come to learn, and this history has not been widely told, but many of the mainline denominations in the 60s had their student movements. So you had your Presbyterian groups, your Baptist groups. One of the biggest ones, and their hub was Nashville, Tennessee, was the Methodist Student Movement. And so Calvin went to Lake Junaluska, which is to this day the summer camp for the Methodist youth. I have some friends, one from Divinity School and one of our colleagues from Tech who are at Lake Junaluska right now at a camp as we speak. And so Calvin went out to Lake Junaluska, and people from the Ecumenical Institute and the Methodist Student Movement had gathered at Lake Junaluska. They were reading the likes of Paul Tillich and things like this, and they were really wrestling with theology, just as young people. But something happened that day that really changed Calvin. And he said, this mentor of his, Bill Mallard, a theologian, professor at Candler, where Calvin and Nelia would get their seminary training, got up, and before he would give his talk, he led the people in the Amen chorus. And this is what Calvin has to say. Calvin says, I don't really remember P. Turkey about what Mallard raised as questions. Now, I had to look that up. That's a Southernism, P. Turkey, but it Googles well. I recommend it. I don't remember P. Turkey about what Mallard raised as questions, but he walked out on stage for the first presentation, and the first thing we did was we sang the Amen chorus with him. And I was immediately won over because the first thing he did was sing, which was really important to me. I mean, I came to Tennessee Tech, and the first things I learned to do were to play the banjo and the guitar and to lead singing, which is what I was really interested in doing at the time. And it was, just encountering all these people that just kept coming in from New York City or from Atlanta or Nashville who were really doing interesting and important and creative things. And so because of the Wesley Foundation, and because of the Methodist Student Movement, and because of their minister Bob Lewis, who I'll introduce you to a little bit more later, Cookeville, of all places, and I've been in Cookeville since 2001, and I would not have pegged Cookeville as having kind of a hotbed of civil rights activism and peace activism and folk music worship and all of the above, but because of a small group that gathered at the Wesley Foundation, it did. So there's Calvin learning to sing and lead music. There's Bill Mallard, a theological influence on him from the mid-60s until Mallard's passing late last year. And there's a great video on YouTube of the Mallard Memorial with Nelia giving a eulogy as part of it, and then at the end, Calvin leading in a large congregation in that Amen chorus. as well. So the Methodist student movement, I've read an anthology of writings of women, and the editor of the anthology specifically wanted to show how Christian youth movements in the 60s influenced the feminist movement and the nascent LGBT movement as well. And so these female authors, talked about how their leadership was formed in the Methodist student movement. And the Methodist student movement fed a group later called the University Christian Movement. And what's really amazing to wrap my mind around this is we do not have the equivalent today in our mainline denominations like this. This is something that we've lost and I think we need to recover. But these Christian youth movements, and it even included the YMCAs and the YWCAs, saw themselves as sort of the church-based and Bible-based aspect of the movement. And so that meant the civil rights movement especially. And it later meant the anti-war movement and many other movements that you know about. But this is a pamphlet from one of the gatherings that Calvin attended. And its title is not ironic. Today when we talk about revolution, all so often there's some sort of irony or joke involved, or cynicism even, or nostalgia. And I must say, I don't believe, as though it might seem, I'm nostalgic about the time period from right when I was born. Having met Calvin and Nelia and knowing the work that you all continue here, this is about the ongoing revolution for the values of the gospel. At that same gathering, when he met Bill Mallard, he read a story by Flannery O'Connor. And I'm just going to do a very poor paraphrase of the ending of the story. But in the story, there are some very kind of uptight Southern Christians, the kind of people you might expect from the Bible Belt. And O'Connor, I'm not an O'Connor scholar, though I do fashion myself as an English teacher, so forgive me here. But her short stories were this very kind of Southern Gothic, kind of dark stories, surrealistic and even almost psychedelic in the way that she told her stories, which made her a perfect 60s author. But in this one story, this uptight kind of do-gooder church lady has a vision of revelation, a vision of heaven. And in this story, it's kind of like there's this promenade, or almost this kind of walkway or escalator going towards heaven, and at the head of the line, in their robes of glory, are the people that this woman didn't like. And she used the N-word. I've just taught never to use that word, so I won't use it, but she used the N-word, and it was the N-word and the white trash. They were at the head of the line. They got first place in glory. And the do-gooders, they had to wait and go to the end of the line. And it kind of blew Calvin's mind, and it's kind of blowing my mind just trying to do my best to retell it now. Another major influence in the South on all of us is the Reverend Will D. Campbell. And as we were talking about Charleston, I've had to go to a book of his. It's a collection of essays on reconciliation and resistance, a compilation of some of his works, some of them previously unpublished before his passing. And in that book, Campbell talks about his response to the segregation and even to some of the murders of civil rights workers in the 60s. And I've been leaning on Campbell a lot this week. But Reverend William D. Campbell, he was the outlaw preacher, the bootleg preacher. He was with King's Inner Circle at the Lorraine Motel, the only white preacher in that inner group in April of '68 at King's passing. And he also ministered to the outlaw country music scene, Chris Christopherson and the likes. And in doing my research, I came across this quote by Campbell, and then I typed this furious email to Calvin and Nelia, and I said, I think this quote from Campbell, it kind of encapsulates everything that you all were about, from the Wesley Foundation to Patchwork Central to the Open Door community. And the question is this. The question is not, will the churches unite? Now I'm quoting Will Campbell. The question is not, will the churches unite to build a kingdom? The question is, here is a kingdom already. Will we enter it and bid others to enter it, reminding them that it is a kingdom beyond caste? And through my continued study of Reverend Campbell, he said that quote over and over and over again. The kingdom has already been inaugurated by Jesus Christ, and we are invited to participate. And when Calvin and Nelia replied to my email, it was so clear from what they were saying. We don't have to build the kingdom. Christ has created the kingdom. We get to already participate. And you probably, many of you are activists, and over your years in the movement have met people who have a chip on their shoulder because they think it's our job to build the kingdom. And so this quote from Campbell really makes our work possible. It makes what we do a little bit easier. It's hard work that we do, but it's a little bit easier because we know that Christ has initiated and inaugurated the kingdom and walks before us, behind us, and with us. So the gospel reference keeps coming back up for me, but one of the people that I started reading a lot over the last couple of years is Harvey Cox, and he's kind of fallen out of fashion, I think, among some, that his secular city analysis took theology a little bit too far into the world, so to speak. But I leaned on Cox really heavily early in my research because the reason I ended up with Calvin and Nelia as my topic is I went into a later, I'm calling Calvin and Nelia the hippie Christians, with hippie as the modifier and Christian as the noun, because I later discovered a group that I'm going to call the Jesus hippies, with Jesus as the modifier and hippie as the noun. And these were the later day kind of sellout hippies, if you will, that were Billy Graham and Campus Crusade for Christ tried to co-opt the hippie movement in the 70s. And I turned to Cox as an antidote for a book that they were all reading in the early 70s called The Late Great Planet Earth. And it's an atrocious and horrible book. I don't recommend anyone even pick it up, but I couldn't believe how bad it sounded, so I actually went and read some of it, and it's as bad as it sounded. And what Cox said in this book, The Feast of Fools, is that we're invited to a celebration, a feast, as we will be partaking from here. And Godspell, the musical, is actually based on the writings of Cox in this book, The Feast of Fools. And Cox says, with Christ the Harlequin, even the churches seem once again to be learning how to play. Dance, lights, rollicking music, mime, and ritual feasting are making their appearance again in the chilly, gray sanctuaries of Christianity. The original author of Godspell, before Schwartz came on to write the music, he'd written a play as a master's thesis in theater. He had attended church on Easter, and it happened to be snowing. It was up north, and it was snowing on Easter, and he said everybody was so depressed and glum and complaining about the snow and how it was going to ruin their Easter. And he said, this is not the church that Jesus talks about, and the resurrection is a festival. And I learned that from Cox, but I had it in my bones dancing around the house as a child. I got in trouble because one day a boy had gone home, and the mother asked how it went, and the mother ended up calling my mother on the telephone and said, what were they doing over there? My son said they were playing Godspell, but Andy kept crucifying himself. I wanted to act out the part, and I always picked the star. The intersection with the secular counterculture really accelerated in the mid-'60s, and it really impacted liturgy. Calvin's archives are meticulous. In their office at the open door, he has an entire wall of perfectly ordered scrapbooks and everything to a T. I mean, he is a researcher's dream. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was hard for me to leave. Once I'm in his office, I wanted to stay, set up camp for a month or something. I had about 12 hours or so in January. But they started incorporating the beat writings of Lawrence Ferlinghetti directly to the worship experience, and the whole kind of, beat idea, and there's other writers that were deeply influential, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Diane DePrima, Leroy Jones, later Amiri Baraka, and the whole Black Arts movement. But the way that they were incorporating the beat performance poetry into their liturgies it's just an amazing thing. And all of the secular folk music, If I Had a Hammer, Blowing in the Wind, and so on. I had, in my years in Detroit, I left church in 1988, and I came back to church in 2009. And in my years as a lapsed heathen, I was involved in a secular activist movement in Detroit around a publication called The Fifth Estate. The Fifth Estate is an anti-authoritarian, radical activist publication that started as part of the underground press in the 1960s. And I had studied the secular, they were free newspapers. And it was like the way we have blogs now. They had free papers in every city, wherever the hippies were, they were handing out newspapers. And they were a bit of kind of counterculture, kind of dreamy, hippie stuff mixed in with anti-war, civil rights, feminist, and the nascent gay rights movement. And these were decent publications, very intellectually savvy, and always on a shoestring budget. But I was not prepared for what I discovered in Motive magazine. Motive magazine was funded by the Methodist Church. It started publishing, I think, in the 40s and made it all the way until the early 70s. But in the 60s, it was the voice of the Christian left in the Methodist Church. And I'm sure there were other Christian progressive left publications that captured the spirit of the movement. But you could read Thomas Merton, Harvey Cox, Sister Corita Kent was in there. The artwork was beautiful. And the funding, this magazine cost 50 cents. 50 cents. It's the art I can have passion on the cover. But the quality of the paper, the quality of the artwork, the quality of the writing, the quality of the editing. If you saw a magazine like Motive today, it would be like a coffee table book. It would be $20 just as a magazine. And it was so well produced and subsidized by the Methodist Church. And in the opening pages, there was hate mail from rank-and-file Methodists all over the country complaining about this. And you could just tell that they just loved getting this hate mail. And then there would be little love letters. And in one of the issues, later in the run, I looked at every issue from the entire period that Calvin and Nelia were active at Tech. So I looked at every Motive from 64, 71, and there was a short little love note from Calvin and Nelia of Cookeville, Tennessee, in one of the later issues that I looked at. But this thing was just bursting with energy, and you could tell that that Calvin and Nelia would pick this up at the Wesley Foundation and read the one copy and kind of pass it amongst themselves. And like Bill Mallard singing the Amen chorus to him that first time, like reading the Flannery O'Connor story, like doing the Lawrence Fairland Getty poems and worship service, by the way, which they did in Beersheba, Tennessee, up on a mountaintop, on like a kind of a mountain vista in Beersheba, Tennessee. They did that whole kind of hippie folk music beatnik liturgy one summer. I think it was summer of '67. So there's Motive. There's an ad there. I mean, even the advertisement. You've got the Bohemian smoking his pipe and the John Knox Press saying these are the plays and poems to read during protests and coffee breaks. The folk music coffeehouse scene was huge. This was back in Knoxville, Tennessee, at UT, the Backdoor Coffee House. It's so important that I want to share this story, and I want to share. I haven't shared it much in Cookeville yet, so that students can see it as well. That this whole thing didn't begin with Mumford and Sons. They need to know that. Sister Corita Kent. An unbelievable artist. I think she was really deeply influenced by Andy Warhol and other people of that time period, the pop art movement. But she was making these huge liturgical statements and doing it with a kind of a pop culture sort of bent. And I purchased a few of her books and found some magazines that she was in, and she was all over the Motive magazine. Just absolutely unbelievable work was happening. And so then in the fall of '67, they're going to be seniors at Tech, or they're supposed to be seniors at Tech, and Calvin and Nelia had kind of been running in parallel lives up until this point, but they've changed their majors to history. Calvin was already leading worship in the Wesley Foundation and having his mind blown by the Methodist student movement. Nelia comes about it in a different way. She gets to spend the summer in the Soviet Union as part of a Methodist student retreat to the Soviet Union. She completely has her mind blown by what she saw. They also got to leave the Soviet Union and go to Prague, and this was right when a lot of the protest movements were happening in Prague. She showed back up at Tennessee Tech in Cookeville, completely changed. Her parents, by the way, conservatives from Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, thought she was going to Satan's lap when she went to the Soviet Union. I mean, they were outraged, and they were freaked out. She was freaked out because her and her mother's relationship was strained. She had been a sorority girl at Tech. She had been a cheerleader in high school. And that fall, she shows up at Tech, and her world is not right, and things are wrong, and nobody understands. Nobody wants to hear about the Soviet Union in Cookeville, Tennessee. And she's at a student mixer with student leaders, student government types, 4.0 types, and she meets this tall guy, and this tall, skinny guy wants to hear all about everything he cares about everything that she's talking about. This is the first person since she's gotten back from the Soviet Union who seems to even care at all about what she's interested in. And the next thing you know, they're talking, as they say today, and then they're dating. And she's about to go home for Thanksgiving, and this is before cell phones, and so this is when you had to stand in line to use the one payphone on the hall in the dormitory. She has to fend off a call, and they both had previous boyfriends and girlfriends. She's fending off a phone call from a suitor who is pledged to bring her an engagement ring at the Thanksgiving holidays, and she just tells him on the phone, I don't think that's a good idea to do that. By Christmas, they're officially dating, and then the peak of the convergence of the New Left and the hippies and the church happened in Cleveland, Ohio, one of my hometowns, in December of '67. They called it the Cleveland Week. This is the flyer. It was the first time, Calvin said, I had ever encountered blacks with afros and overalls, men with long hair and beards, and of course I didn't have long hair and a beard, but it was a wonderful being there. And this was a happening festival with jazz bands and film festivals, and they had the entire conference on closed circuit TVs. And it was a complete confluence of New Left, hippies, and the church. And it was mind-blowing. And Calvin, in these particular scrapbooks, opens up a letter, and it's on the hotel envelope, and then we pulled it out, and it was written on pink tissue paper, and it was in bold black Sharpie marker, and it was this beautiful love letter to Nelia, and it was all about the love beads and the boots and the beards and everything that was happening in Cleveland. And so by that spring of '68, they were a thing, and they needed $40 because if they had $40, they could afford to get an apartment. So once they raised $40, they hit up Bob Lewis, the minister of the Wesley Foundation, and they were married in the Wesley Foundation in the spring of '68, and their friend Bob McIntyre described it as a flower child, barefoot, hippie wedding. They wrote their own vows. It was very sparsely attended. It was just a select group of a few people, but it was very intentional and very beautiful. But they told both of their respective parents just a few days before, and some family came, and some family was like, I've got other plans, I won't be there. They returned to Wesley in the 70s to be ordained to the ministry of the United Methodist Church, and they're still both clergy in good standing in the Tennessee Conference of the Methodist Church. Just a couple days ago, a week or so ago, they were given an award, the Social Holiness Award by the United Methodist Church, the Tennessee Conference, and they had a big festival gathering in Nashville to celebrate their honor. So from '68 till '71, Nelia and Calvin collaborated on many things in the Wesley Foundation. They taught classes. Nelia taught anti-racism groups. Calvin led music, and they were a thing. And as far as I can tell from reading all of the different pamphlets and the worship bulletins, everything that was going on with the music and the culture of the time was being embedded in to the Wesley Foundation. So there were happenings. A happening was like a multimedia, multi-sensory event that one could do, but they did it as a worship service in the Wesley Foundation one Sunday. But as they were telling me the stories, and it was really cool because Calvin would say one thing, and that would remind Nelia to say another thing. And as they were telling the stories, Calvin said it was when the gay guys came from New York. And well, the gay guy that they were talking about was the Reverend Al Carmines, a music minister in New York City, and he became later a Broadway writer, wrote many, many musicals. And Carmines showed up in Cookeville and in the Wesley Foundation building, and Nelia tells it like this. He designed a happening for us that took place at the Sunday morning worship. He moved us. We started out in the living room of the foundation in the womb, being born. We all got down in the fetal position on the floor and got birthed. He moved us through all the life stages, and he moved us through the building. And it ended up outside in the courtyard there, between the arena and the main building, and we were doing all this dancing and yelling, and we have streamers and paper flowers, just as the College Side Church of Christ is letting out. So on the south side of 9th Street, this is the block from Tennessee Tech, on the south side of 9th Street, you have the Wesley Foundation, and you have all these Wesley hippies dancing in the yard after this happening with a bohemian gay New York reverend from Judson Memorial Church, one of the first churches to provide counseling services to women who needed to get abortions before it was legal. The Reverend Howard Moody of Judson Memorial Church, and College Side Church of Christ is, Nashville, Lipscomb Church of Christ, and it's the opposite. It was the antithesis, and so it was like there was the culture, the culture clash right there. Calvin does not remember participating in that many anti-war activities, but he did participate in an anti-war activity at Tech following. And you can see when I saw these pictures of them, I just was just entranced. Their spirits just shine forth from them. And this is something about them, even though they've been involved in very serious work their entire lives, and have made choices that have made them not ambitious in one way because of their commitment to the gospel, but they've taken on some of the most depressing and dark parts of American culture and original sin, the original sin of racism and sexism and homophobia, and they've done that with joy, with so much joy and so much vigor, and this is what we love about them so much. And so after Kent State massacre in Ohio in 1970, they organized a protest at Tennessee Tech, and I have a great story to go with that, but I can't tell it because I'm running out of time. But one of the things that was really important for Calvin to do that night was to talk about how music happened. And they had a midnight worship service. The Saturday after the Kent State massacre, they have a midnight worship service that was at midnight on Saturday. So the crack of the Sabbath, if you will, the first talk of midnight that they would have worship. And he sang the song by Pete Seeger, The Letter to Eve. Just a couple lines from that Pete Seeger song. Don't you wish love, only love, can save this world from disaster? Love, only love, can save this world from disaster. Don't you wish love could end the confusion? Or is that just more of an illusion? And there's a line in here, yes, if music could bring peace, I would only be a musician. If music could bring peace, I would only be a musician. And Calvin was so intent that I had to go and discover this song. It's now become another of my favorite Pete Seeger songs. And as aware I am of the time, these are pictures here. This is them at this place. That's your place. Doing the things that we do here, which we make music, which you all have made some music. We'll make some more music here in a minute. And we have a Sunday night worship service that revolves around this table. So, as my time with the Kimbroughs was coming to a close on my last research trip to Atlanta, Nelia started to get talking to me about the Eucharist and about worship and how she did worship as an artist, and how worship was kind of a liturgical performance piece. How she doesn't use a script when she preaches at all, no manuscripts. She told me a horror story in seminary about having to preach from a manuscript and how it kind of cured her of that forever. And she started to really talk to me about how the Eucharist kind of saved her faith, really. And she said, going into the women's movement, then of course, called everything into question about patriarchy in the church. The question was continually raised, she said, how can you be a feminist and stay in the institutional church? Now, I don't know among you all, but when I left the church in my 20s and 30s, it was, how can you be a feminist? How can you support gay rights? How can you be, in my case, it was an anarchist. Unfortunately, in my case, it was also how can you be an alcoholic and a drug addict and stay in the institutional church? And I have to confess that was one of the main reasons I left my faith, was to pursue those worldly sins, of which I am 6 years clean and sober, thank God. So, she said, how can you be a feminist and stay in the institutional church? There were all kinds of rituals and celebrations, and everything was being created. So I don't know if anybody remembers the women's movement in the early 70s, or has even been around women's movement culture where new rituals are being created, and ritual is a big part of this. But she says, there were all kinds of rituals and celebrations, and everything was being created. Alternative myths being created. There was women's everything going on. So I begin to place myself and substitute everything I've experienced in the institutional church with what's happening and being created in the feminist movement, except for the Eucharist. I cannot find anything that is comparable for me to the Eucharist. When I get to that point in seminary, I realize with all the great sins and oppressions, I cannot leave the church because I cannot leave the Eucharist. So I stay. One of my nagging research questions was, how did you all stay in the movement? Many people of their station in life and of their generation left the movement. Many Christian revolutionaries of the 1960s became the Christian conservatives of the 1980s. And that Jesus hippie movement was really an attempt of the Republican Party and Billy Graham and people like that to co-opt the counterculture, as I learned more through my research. And I asked them several times, I got different answers every time, why did you all stay committed to your values? But one of the things that Calvin said was feminism was a big reason why they stayed rooted in progressive movements, being aware. In the 60s, they became aware of racial oppression and of civil rights. Then they became aware of war and the damage of militarism. But then, in the 70s, gender issues became really prominent in their ministries and in their understandings of the church. And so then they said, and here comes y'all, she says, by the time we got to Evansville, to start the community there, all of the couples, that's one of the places where we were extremely compatible. All three of the couples said, we will be a Eucharistic community. And that was the first thing we did, was we celebrated the Eucharist. And that was the first thing we opened up to the neighborhood to come join us, was for the Eucharist. And we will do it in a welcome, open table style. Anyone is welcome here. It doesn't matter how old or young you are. And we served in a circle, serving each other. What I came to realize is, how can you do this work? How can you work in those broken places and not have the Eucharist every Sunday to restore you and renew you? I don't understand how secular social workers do it. And I don't understand how people do it without having a community that has a shared ethic and a shared understanding of the value of the liturgy and the Eucharist. We say at the Open Door that our Eucharistic table extends to every meal we serve. That's what we say. We say it all the time. So a couple of weeks ago, we were totally out of sandwiches. We're getting to the sandwiches now. And we give out 2,000 sandwiches a week. So we need to make sandwiches to have them ready for next week to serve. And the worship service then, I designed to be truly the extension of the Eucharistic table. And that we made the sandwiches right there as part of the service. We all shared Eucharist with one another, and then we got out the meat and the cheese and 70 loaves of bread, and everybody made the sandwiches together. That week, we all watched when the sandwiches we made got consumed and eaten. So I had spent a wonderful 2 days in January. It ended up being the feast day of Thomas Merton. It was Thomas Merton's 100th birthday, the day that I was there, and I love Thomas Merton, and I recommend, if you've never been to Gethsemane in Kentucky, it's a really, really beautiful place. So I had to be back in Cookeville. Jeannie was home waiting for me, and it was time to go. And as a kind of a parting goodbye, Nelia packed me some peanut butter and orange marmalade sandwiches. and she packed me some other snacks and put it in my little lunch cooler, and I hit the road. And I'm going to go from Atlanta to Cookeville. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Atlanta, or as this week they're calling it, Hot Atlanta. They have a lot of traffic in Atlanta. And so I immediately was stuck in traffic on trying to get on to a highway. And this was one of those, the highway is so congested that the on-ramp to the highway has a stoplight. And so I'm standing in line to get on the highway, and I decide it's time for a peanut butter and orange marmalade sandwich. And so I reach into my bag, and she has made me exactly 1.5 orange marmalade and peanut butter sandwiches. And I thought, well, I love to eat peanut butter and marmalade sandwiches, but I really don't need 1.5 sandwiches. I really just need one sandwich. And by then, I'm almost to the front of the line to get onto the expressway. And there we see somebody, as we say, flying a sign that he is hungry. And so I rolled down the window, and I knew immediately what that other half sandwich was for. And so I handed it to him through the window of my car. And I went home with Nelia and Calvin on my mind, and knowing that every sandwich is the body of Christ. And we make it with love, and we share it with love, and know that we are nourished just as Christ nourished us with that supper so long ago. I think we're ready for a communion song. Thank you all so much. It's an honor to be here.